course, no one in the community asked what the real question should have been. Why would any man have to steal chickens to feed his family? And Mrs. Sneed gave the dollar to Joanne and said, "Here, honey." But to Snake, she said, "Bend over and pull your pants down. You're going to learn not to steal, not to lie in my class." And with that long paddle we all feared, we cringed each time Mrs. Sneed's arm came down to deliver another blow. Whack! 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 15 clicks. And I remember clearly how I tried to shrink down below the desk, fearing that someday I too might get such a beating. When it was over, Snake straightened up, his head held high, his shoulders back, his chest pushed out. Then he began to limp back to his seat at the back of the room. About midway to his desk, he leaned over to me and he whispered, "Shit, that wasn't nothing." Like lightning, Mrs. Sneed flew down the aisle and dragged Snake by the hair of his head to the sink at the back of the room. And then she washed his mouth out with bar soap and then used medical tape to tape his mouth shut. And then for the final humiliation, she said, "Pritchy, I want you to take Snake by the hand, and I want you to lead him all around the playground at recess and tell all the teachers and the children in the other grades just what he did." Well, of course, I wanted to prove myself worthy of Mrs. Sneed. I wanted to show her that I was one of the good poor boys who didn't live across the tracks. So I walked Snake all around the playground, and I said, Snake stole $1 from Joanne Henderson. He lied about it, then he got a whipping, and then he said a bad word, and that's why he has tape on his mouth." Of course, the teachers on the playground set their lips in disapproval and shake their heads. I would say again, and again, it seemed like 1,000 times that day, Snake stole $1 from Joanne Henderson, then he lied about it, then he got a whipping, then he said a bad word, that's why he's got tape on his mouth. Recess seemed to last forever that day, as I would lead Snake around to each person. With all the tape on his mouth, about all I could see of Snake's face were his eyes. His eyes were welled up with tears. The whole time that I led him around the school ground. Well, I felt bad that day, and for a long time after. Now, to make a short story, or a long story short, Snake was one of those boys who didn't go on past the 8th grade. He was one of those boys from across the tracks who didn't go to high school. As he put it, he had to go to work to help out the family. Later on, as was common in those days, he would lie about his age and join the Air Force. About the time I graduated with a bachelor's degree from the University of Texas in 1961, I ran into Snake one weekend when I was in my hometown visiting my mother. In fact, I sat in the car with him and had a beer at the parking lot at the Dairy Queen. And I asked Snake if he remembered that time in the 4th grade when I led him all around the playground with his mouth taped. I told him I'd been scared that day, afraid he would beat me up after school. He said, "Heck, Pritchy, it wasn't your fault." Then I asked him, "Snake, did you steal that $1 from Joanne's purse?" He looked at me with an expression that seemed to accuse me of questioning his integrity. His eyes turned cold and hard. Then he asked, "Well, Pritchy, what do you think?" I left Snake that evening, feeling ashamed that I had even asked. A few years later, I heard that Snake and James McMillan, another boy from across the tracks, now a man, were sitting in a car in front of the same Dairy Queen, arguing about Myrtle Fincannon, who was sitting between the two of them, when McMillan reached around Myrtle and shot Snake in the head with a pistol. Now, there are many things that we could extract from the story I just told. You know, on one level, it's just a simple story about how a child named Pritchy Smith came to a sense of social justice in the 4th grade, or rather, social injustice. You know, that is, it's just about the poor children in a small Texas town who were born into a rigid social hierarchy and how they were treated by the privileged in that community. And then, of course, how their opportunities for access to the privilege possessed by the haves are almost non-existent. At this level, you know, it's also a story about oppression blindness. For example, today in my hometown, the story is almost exactly the same. There have been some changes. Many of the poor white families who lived across the tracks have now been replaced by poor Mexican-American families. But the basic structure of oppression remains as it was when I was a 10-year-old boy, nearly 60 years ago, or over 60 years ago. Now, the truth is that any good social analyst could have gone into my hometown and with only 2 pieces of data: family name and location of residence, meaning across the tracks. That social analyst could predict with 90% accuracy the likely success or failure of the children as adults. A social analyst might not be able to predict that Snake Snyder would be murdered at age 25, but he would be able to predict that without intervention, 10-year-old Snake Snyder likely would come to no good end as an adult. Now, at another level, Snake Snyder's fable is a story about our nation. Snake's story is the counter-narrative to the lies about our nation in the traditional curriculum. That is, that America is the greatest nation in the world, a great democratic nation where everyone is equal. No, Snake's narrative is the story of systemic oppression in America. As you all know in here who took my classes, I believe that the longest running, most embarrassing failure of our society is the undereducation of poor children, the undereducation of children of color, and the undereducation of children who speak languages other than English. The undereducation of these children constitutes nothing less than willfully permitted, if not planned, educational injustice. I also believe that this nation could achieve educational justice. You know, we could provide poor children with the same high-quality education as we provide for the white middle-class suburban children. To do so, however, we cannot be silent any longer. We can't be passive any longer. Rather, we must be advocates for educational justice. As most of you have heard me say before, we have to stand in the right line. You see, as my mother often told me, sometimes it's better to do the right thing than to do a thing right. Many of my generation, as you well know, were shaped by the civil rights and peace movements of the 1960s and 1970s. And oh, we naively thought we were going to change the world. In fact, for a brief moment in time, we did change parts of the United States. But as you are all aware, The neoconservative movement that began with Reagan and the publication of A Nation at Risk has reversed almost all of the gains that we made toward an equitable society in the 60s and 70s. Today, as you know already, the schools are more segregated now than they were in 1969, 1 year after Dr. Martin Luther King's assassination. Today, children of the privileged, on average, receive twice the per pupil expenditure that is spent on poor children like Snake Snyder. Today, Mexican American and African American children are 4 to 5 times more likely to be placed in special education classes than are white children. And today, poor white children are more likely than privileged white children to be placed in special education classes. Today, privileged white students occupy over 90% of the seats in gifted classes and AP classes, even though those white students constitute only about 65% of the students. Furthermore, this neoconservative standards-based reform movement has turned out to be little more than an intensified cruel assault on poor children, children of color, children who speak first languages other than English. Now, I see many of you in this audience out there as the next generation of educational researchers and teachers and leaders. Now, I can only say to you, if you want to make a difference, remember Dr. Martin Luther King's words, an injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. If you want to make a difference, do research. Research that gives voice to the poor. Conduct research that peels away, layer by layer, the lies that prevent so many people from seeing the oppression that continues to exist in our nation. And rather than feeding the poor at a homeless shelter this next Thanksgiving, ask why the poor have no food in the world's richest nation. If you want to make a difference, teach. Teach for social justice. Empower the poor and the marginalized to overthrow these structures of power that keep systemic oppression in place. We may indeed yet have to have another revolution. If you want to make a difference, lead. Lead by example. Lead by living a life committed to social justice. Lead to bring down these mighty walls of oppression. Simply put, if you want to make a difference, grow. Grow a soul for social change. So it is with a bit of sadness that I retire from a profession that has taken such a beating from the neoconservatives over the last 3 decades. It's with a bit of sadness that I retire knowing that much of what we accomplished in the 60s and 70s and early 80s has now been reversed by this neoconservative movement. But it is also with a spark of hope that I entrust you, the next generation, to do a better job than did my generation. We educators may not live to see the changes we work for, but the next generation will enjoy the shade of the trees we planted. Thank you very much.